There is a group of people born at a strangely precise moment in history. Not early enough to fully belong to the world of typewriters and rotary phones. Not late enough to grow up with Wi-Fi, smartphones, and social media as default settings of reality. They don't quite fit into Gen X. They don't fully belong to millennials either. They exist in a narrow slice between two eras, those born between 1976 and 1986. Sometimes I think of this generation as travelers across centuries, not because they have lived longer than others, but because they have lived through a transformation so dramatic it felt like stepping from one age into another in less than a decade. I still remember memorizing phone numbers, not storing them, memorizing them. I remember the quiet anxiety of waiting for a favorite TV show to air, knowing that if you missed it, it was simply gone. No replay, no streaming, no backup. The world had edges. Moments could disappear, and then, almost overnight, everything shifted. The internet moved into our bedrooms. Email replaced handwritten letters. Friendster appeared, then MySpace, then Facebook. I remember the first time I logged into a social platform and felt something subtle but undeniable. The world had tilted. Not gradually, suddenly. For years, I thought the strange feeling of being in between meant confusion, not cynical enough to be Gen X, not digitally native enough to be fully millennial. But as I've grown older, I've realized something different. It wasn't confusion, it was calibration. The 1976 to 1986 group grew up analog but entered adulthood digital. They learned patience before speed. They learned waiting before downloading. So they learned how to sit in silence before algorithms began filling every empty space. And what makes this so psychologically powerful is timing. The technological revolution did not happen when this group was already fully formed. It didn't happen when they were small children either. It happened during the most neurologically flexible years of their lives, late adolescence and early adulthood. At the very moment, identity, ambition, and worldview were solidifying. That timing matters more than most people realize. This generation does not fear technology, but it is not defined by it. It understands privacy in a way younger generations never experienced. It remembers a world where you could not be reached, and that memory changes how you relate to constant connection. If you were born in that decade, you may have felt it yourself. See the quiet pull of nostalgia, but not obsession. The ability to adapt to new tools, but not dependence. The desire for stability, mixed with an instinct for reinvention. You may have wondered why you feel both independent and collaborative, skeptical and optimistic, grounded and digitally fluent. The answer may not be personality. It may be historical positioning. This group didn't just witness technological transformation. It was psychologically shaped by it. They entered the workforce just as the 2008 financial crisis shattered illusions of economic stability. They built early memories in a world without permanent digital records. Their embarrassing teenage moments were stories, not searchable archives. They grew up with less supervision, less constant monitoring, and more unstructured freedom. They had to solve boredom on their own. They had to navigate disappointment without instant reassurance. They learned self-reliance before GPS directions and online tutorials became universal. All of that leaves an imprint. In this exploration, we are not simply going to indulge nostalgia. We are going to decode the psychological architecture formed by this rare historical window. We'll examine why this group adapts quickly, yet craves stability. Why it values privacy, yet navigates digital systems comfortably. Why financial anxiety still lingers even after years of professional growth. If you belong to this generation, this may be the first time your experience feels accurately contextualized, not as an identity crisis, but as a structural advantage. And if you don't belong to it, And understanding this microgeneration may help you understand the bridge builders around you, those who can speak both languages of analog and digital fluently. For a long time, I believed that not fitting neatly into a generational box was a weakness. Now I see it differently. Not belonging to a single era may not be a flaw. It may be a function. Perhaps the so-called pivotal generation was never meant to fit cleanly into history's categories. Perhaps it was meant to connect them. Chapter 1. Analog Childhood. When boredom was a companion. Before notifications, before timelines, before the endless scroll, there was something that quietly shaped the early psychology of those born between 1976 and 1986 in a way few people fully appreciate today. Boredom. Not the restless, anxious boredom that sends someone reaching for a phone within seconds. Not the modern discomfort of being temporarily offline. But long, unstructured stretches of time where nothing was happening, and nothing was going to happen unless you made it happen. For children growing up in the 1980s and early 1990s, entertainment was finite. Television signed off at night. Cartoons aired at specific hours. If you missed them, you waited a week. Music had to be physically purchased, rewound, flipped over. Video games had no downloadable updates. What you owned was what you had. There were no infinite feeds, no autoplay, no algorithm designed to predict your attention span and hijack it. And inside that silence, something powerful was forming. When you had to memorize phone numbers instead of tapping a name on a screen, you strengthened recall. When you waited by the landline for a friend to call, you learned anticipation. When you rode your bike across the neighborhood without GPS, you developed spatial awareness and risk assessment. The world required participation. Boredom in that era was not a failure of stimulation. It was a training ground. If you were part of this generation, you likely remember being told to go outside and figure something out. There were no curated playlists for your emotions, no YouTube tutorials for every frustration. If you were bored, so you invented a game. If you were stuck, you experimented. If you were lonely, you knocked on someone's door. That repeated pattern, problem, pause, self-generated solution, built a subtle psychological muscle. Delayed gratification. You learned that enjoyment required effort, that plans required coordination, that rewards often came after waiting. Even simple pleasures, like renting a movie, involved driving to a store, hoping it was available, and returning it on time. Today, friction is minimized. In the analog childhood, friction was normal, and friction builds patience. Research in developmental psychology shows that the ability to tolerate boredom correlates with creativity and self-regulation. When external stimulation is limited, the brain begins to generate its own narratives, games, and internal dialogue. In other words, the boredom forces the mind to become active rather than reactive. For the 1976 to 1986 group, that mental habit formed before the internet ever arrived. This matters more than it seems, because once the digital age exploded, this generation did not approach it with a mind conditioned by constant stimulation. They approached it with a mind trained in stillness first. There is also something else rarely discussed, the emotional privacy of that era. If you embarrassed yourself at 13, the memory lived in a small circle. There was no permanent record, no viral amplification. Mistakes faded naturally. Stories changed over time. Identity evolved without screenshots. That kind of environment allowed experimentation without surveillance. So you could try on different versions of yourself without fearing that your teenage missteps would follow you into adulthood. You could fail socially and recover quietly. The psychological effect of this is profound. It encourages resilience without chronic self-consciousness. Contrast that with growing up in a world where every moment can be documented, archived, and replayed indefinitely. Analog childhood provided room to grow without an audience. It also provided distance. When friends went home, they were unreachable. When school ended, it ended. There was no group chat extending social pressure into the night. Conflict cooled naturally. Separation was real. That separation created boundaries. And boundaries create emotional regulation. This is not nostalgia. It is structural analysis. And the children of that era experienced a rhythm of engagement and disengagement, interaction and solitude, noise and quiet. That oscillation trained the nervous system to handle pauses without panic. So when technology later removed most natural pauses from daily life, this generation already had a template for balance. They remember what silence feels like. They remember what it feels like to not be reachable. They remember what it feels like to sit in a room and let their thoughts wander without interruption. And perhaps that is why, even today, many from this group report a subtle discomfort with constant digital immersion. Not rejection, but awareness. They use technology, but they remember life before it. Boredom was not an enemy in their childhood. It was a companion, a quiet teacher that said, "Entertain yourself. Solve it yourself. Imagine something. Wait." And waiting, in psychological terms, is one of the most underrated forms of strength, because waiting builds patience. Patience builds discipline. Discipline builds identity. Long before they ever logged into a social network, the 1976 to 1986 generation was building internal networks. Imagination, memory, resilience, and self-soothing capacities that came from managing unstructured time. In a world now designed to eliminate boredom at all costs, that early training may be one of their greatest hidden advantages. They did not grow up in an optimized environment. They grew up in a human one, and that difference shaped everything that followed. Chapter 2: The Leap into the Digital Age. For the 1976 to 1986 group, the transition from analog to digital did not unfold gently. It was not a gradual integration. It was a leap. And what makes that leap psychologically unique is timing. At 15, life still revolved around handwritten notes passed across classrooms, mixtapes carefully recorded from the radio, and calling a friend's house hoping their parent wouldn't answer. Communication required courage. Social risk felt immediate and physical. By 25, many from this same group were creating email accounts, building early social media profiles, and navigating a professional world that suddenly demanded digital literacy. The gap between 18 and 25 for this generation may be one of the most technologically disruptive 7-year spans in modern history. Think about that. One moment, and adulthood meant printed resumes and classified ads in newspapers. A few years later, it meant online job portals and LinkedIn profiles. One moment, dating meant meeting through friends or shared physical spaces. A few years later, it meant messaging someone you had never seen in person. This was not evolution. It felt like acceleration. And psychologically, acceleration does something specific. It forces adaptation. Unlike younger generations who were introduced to technology before identity fully formed, this group had already developed a sense of self before the digital layer wrapped around it. Their childhood identities were shaped offline. Their social hierarchies were experienced face-to-face. Their early confidence, or insecurity, was built in physical environments. Then suddenly, a second arena appeared. So now identity had to be translated. Who are you in a profile? How do you represent yourself in text? How do you maintain authenticity in a space that encourages performance? This was new territory. And here lies one of the most overlooked psychological advantages of this generation. They had to consciously learn the digital world. It was not instinctive. It was studied. They remember dial-up sounds. They remember waiting for pages to load. They remember the first time they uploaded a photo and realized that something private had become shareable. Every step into the digital world was deliberate because it was unfamiliar. That deliberateness created awareness. Where later generations may move fluidly, but unconsciously within digital systems, this group often carries a layer of meta-awareness. So they can step back and observe the system because they remember when it didn't exist. They know that online identity is constructed because they remember constructing it. This produces a subtle but important psychological trait: cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is the ability to switch between frameworks, adapt strategies, and tolerate change without losing internal coherence. It is not just about learning new tools, it is about holding two realities at once: analog norms and digital norms, private self and public self, permanent record and fleeting moment. The 1976 to 1986 group had to reconcile contradictions quickly. At 20, you might have been writing essays by hand. At 27, you were expected to master new software at work. At 22, your social circle was local. At 29, you could reconnect with classmates from across the country instantly. This forced expansion of social cognition. But it also created tension. Because when change happens too quickly, stability feels fragile. Some in this group describe a persistent sense that the ground can shift at any time. Technology upgrades, industries collapse, platforms disappear. What was cutting edge yesterday is obsolete tomorrow. Growing up during a digital explosion builds adaptability, but it also builds vigilance. You learn not to anchor your identity to a single system. You learn to expect reinvention, and reinvention becomes a survival skill. There is another layer to this leap that deserves attention. Authority structures changed. In the analog world, information flowed top-down. Teachers, news anchors, encyclopedias. Knowledge had gatekeepers. And in the digital world, information flattened. Forums, blogs, peer networks. This generation witnessed that authority transition firsthand. They saw institutions lose monopoly over knowledge. They saw how narratives could fragment. They saw how misinformation could spread. And because they remember both models, they often hold a healthy skepticism, not pure distrust, but not blind acceptance either. They learned to verify. They learned to cross-check. They learned that technology amplifies both truth and illusion, and that dual awareness creates psychological complexity. The leap into the digital age was not just technological adaptation, it was identity recalibration under pressure. Unlike Gen X, who largely entered adulthood before digital saturation, and unlike younger millennials and Gen Z who grew up fully embedded in it, this microgeneration had to straddle transformation during formative years. They were old enough to remember what changed, young enough to absorb it. That positioning may be why many from this group can sit comfortably in a meeting discussing AI tools, and then later choose to disconnect completely without feeling lost. They do not romanticize the past blindly. They do not worship the future naively. They compare. And comparison builds discernment. The leap was abrupt. It was destabilizing at times. It required humility, admitting you did not understand new systems, and courage, choosing to learn them anyway. But in that leap, a psychological pattern solidified. Adapt, but do not dissolve. And evolve, but remember. Engage, but observe. The digital age did not erase the analog child. It layered on top of it. And that layering created a mind capable of translation. Between speeds, between cultures, between eras. Not stuck between worlds. Fluent in both. Chapter 3. The Secret of the Prefrontal Cortex. If the analog childhood built patience and the digital leap demanded adaptation, then there is a deeper layer beneath both of those experiences. one that operates silently inside the brain. Timing. More specifically, neurological timing. The human brain does not fully mature at 18. It does not even fully mature at 21. One of the last regions to complete development is the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for executive function, decision-making, impulse control, long-term planning, emotional regulation, and cognitive flexibility. And here is the critical detail. The prefrontal cortex continues developing until around age 25. Now consider the historical timeline. For those born between 1976 and 1986, the explosion of the internet, social platforms, and digital integration happened during late adolescence and early adulthood, precisely when the prefrontal cortex was still wiring itself. This matters enormously. If technological transformation had happened when they were small children, it would have shaped their foundational neural pathways differently. If it had happened when they were fully mature adults, adaptation might have been slower and more resistant. Instead, it happened during what neuroscientists sometimes call a window of plasticity. Plasticity refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself, to form new neural connections in response to experience. Now, during the late teens and early 20s, this plasticity remains high, but identity is already forming. It is a rare overlap between flexibility and structure. The 1976 to 1986 group experienced digital acceleration during that overlap. They were not passive recipients of technology. They were actively integrating it while building adult cognition. This created something unique, adaptive integration rather than dependency. Because their early neural patterns were built in a slower, analog world, they developed foundational capacities like sustained attention, face-to-face emotional reading, and boredom tolerance. But because their brains were still flexible when digital tools arrived, they could incorporate rapid information processing, multitasking, and online navigation without total disruption of identity, where they were neurologically positioned to absorb change. Not perfectly, not without stress, but effectively. Cognitive flexibility. The ability to switch between tasks, perspectives, and problem-solving strategies is heavily influenced by the prefrontal cortex. And this generation was essentially training that region under technological pressure. Imagine learning to drive while the roads themselves are being redesigned. That was the experience. This may explain why many in this group feel comfortable learning new systems even today. They have already survived one massive technological paradigm shift during formative years. Updating skills does not feel existential. It feels familiar. But there is another side to this neurological story. Rapid environmental change during identity formation can also heighten vigilance. When the rules keep shifting, the brain learns to scan for instability. It develops a low-level alertness. What's next? What will change now? This subtle tension, adaptability mixed with underlying alertness, is a psychological fingerprint of transitional generations. They are not overwhelmed by change, but they are rarely surprised by it either. The prefrontal cortex also governs long-term planning. And consider how this group entered adulthood. Industries were restructuring, career paths were digitizing, and the idea of a single lifelong profession was dissolving. Traditional career maps blurred just as executive planning abilities were solidifying. As a result, many from this generation developed a hybrid planning style. Cautious but flexible. They plan, but with contingency. They commit, but with backup strategies. They learned early that stability is conditional, and because their executive function matured during instability, they internalized adaptation as part of adulthood itself. There is something quietly powerful about this. Younger generations often develop digital fluency before emotional regulation is fully established. Older generations may have deeply established cognitive frameworks that resist technological intrusion. But this micro-generation integrated digital acceleration into a brain still shaping its regulatory systems. They learned to manage both. They learned to handle email overload while building impulse control. They learned to navigate online arguments while strengthening emotional boundaries. They learned to evaluate new information streams while refining critical thinking. They were not born digital natives, and they became digital adults. And there is a difference. Becoming implies conscious effort, trial and error, reflection, adjustment. That reflective layer is what creates perspective. Many from this group can look at emerging technologies today, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, algorithmic personalization, and feel neither blind enthusiasm nor total rejection. Instead, they assess, because they remember when the internet itself felt revolutionary. They have lived through one cycle of hype, integration, and normalization. Neurologically, they carry two operating systems, one wired in stillness, one trained in acceleration, and the bridge between them was built during the final maturation of executive function. This is not accidental. It is historical neurotiming. The world changed when their brains were ready enough to adapt, but not so fixed that adaptation felt like loss of identity. That delicate balance may be one of the defining psychological advantages of the so-called pivotal generation. They were not too early. They were not too late. They were neurologically aligned with disruption. And that alignment shaped how they think, how they plan, how they regulate, and how they survive change. Not by resisting it, not by dissolving into it, but by integrating it. Chapter 4. Technological bilingualism. The advantage of arriving early. There is a quiet confidence that comes from remembering what the world felt like before it became permanently connected. Those born between 1976 and 1986 did not enter life with a screen already glowing in their hands. They entered a world where conversation required proximity, where plans required coordination, and where silence was not a technical failure, but a natural state. They learned to read faces before they learned to read text messages. They learned to hear tone in a voice rather than guess it from punctuation. Conflict happened in real time. Resolution required presence. And then the world introduced a second language. Digital communication did not simply add convenience. It altered tempo. It shortened patience. It removed physical cues. And it created a new arena where identity could be curated, edited, and broadcast. For those who were already adolescents or young adults when this shift accelerated, adapting required intention. It was not instinctive, it was learned. Learning a second language later in life creates awareness. You compare grammar. You notice differences in structure. You think before speaking. Technological adaptation worked in a similar way. This generation did not dissolve into digital culture automatically. They stepped into it. They experimented. They made mistakes publicly and privately. They watched platforms rise and disappear. They experienced the awkwardness of early online identities and the evolution of digital etiquette. Because they remember the world before constant connectivity, they carry an internal reference point. They know what uninterrupted time feels like. They know what it means to leave the house and be unreachable. They know the emotional rhythm of a friendship that survives days of silence without insecurity. That memory matters. It creates space inside the nervous system. When someone from this generation sets their phone down for an hour, the world does not feel like it is collapsing. Disconnection is not foreign. It is familiar. It was once normal. At the same time, they are not intimidated by technology. They built early email accounts. They learned new software as workplaces digitized. They navigated social media while it was still forming its rules. They were not born fluent. They became fluent. And becoming creates depth. There is a difference between growing up inside a system and witnessing its construction. When you witness construction, you understand that the system is not permanent. It can be redesigned, it can fail, it can be replaced. Many from this transitional group approach technology with quiet discernment. They use it efficiently, but rarely worship it. They integrate it into their lives, but do not allow it to define their core identity. They remember when certain platforms felt unstoppable. They remember when specific technologies seemed revolutionary. They also remember how quickly those certainties faded. That memory builds psychological balance. It softens extremes. They are less likely to romanticize the past blindly because they remember its limitations. But they are also less likely to assume the present is the final form of progress. They have lived through enough transformation to understand that today's permanence is often temporary. This dual awareness affects relationships. Many from this group can sit across from someone at dinner and remain fully present. Eye contact does not feel threatening. Silence does not feel empty. There is no compulsion to document every moment. At the same time, they can maintain digital networks across distance. They understand online communication norms. They can shift from in-person dialogue to digital correspondence without confusion. They move between speeds, slow and immediate, private and public, offline and online. This ability to adjust tempo is subtle but powerful. In professional environments, it often shows up as mediation. They can understand colleagues who prefer structure and hierarchy. They can also relate to those who thrive in fluid, fast-paced digital ecosystems. They can translate, and translation is influence. There is also resilience embedded in technological bilingualism. When you remember life before a tool existed, you are less dependent on that tool for identity or survival. If the platform changes, you adapt. If the interface updates, you learn it. If a system disappears, you build again, because you have already done it once. Perhaps the greatest advantage of arriving early is not superiority. It is perspective. Perspective tempers panic. It reduces blind enthusiasm. It allows for curiosity without surrender. The 1976 to 1986 generation stands at an unusual intersection. They are not overwhelmed by innovation because they have integrated massive change before. They are not entirely comfortable with digital saturation either because they remember spaciousness. They understand both hunger for connection and the need for retreat. They are not stuck between worlds. They are literate in both. And in an era where extremes dominate, total immersion or total rejection, literacy may be the most stable position of all. Chapter 5. Privacy and the Evolution of Memory. There was a time when growing up meant leaving very little evidence behind. Photographs were limited. Cameras required intention. Film had to be developed. If a picture was embarrassing, it could be hidden in a drawer or quietly thrown away. Stories about teenage mistakes were told around kitchen tables or at reunions, and with each retelling, they softened. Memory was fluid. It changed shape over time. For those born between 1976 and 1986, adolescence unfolded largely outside permanent digital documentation. There were awkward phases, social missteps, experimental identities, but they were not archived online. They existed in memory, not in databases. And that distinction shapes psychology more than we often realize. When memory is internal, it evolves. Psychologists have long observed that human memory is not a recording device. It is reconstructive. Every time we revisit a memory, we subtly reshape it. We reinterpret it. We integrate new meaning into it. Over time, painful events can become humorous stories. Embarrassing mistakes can become formative lessons. This natural evolution allows identity to mature. But when memory is externalized, captured in photos, posts, comments, and timestamps, it freezes. Digital documentation does not forget. It does not soften. It does not reinterpret. It remains. For the transitional generation, this difference created a psychological buffer during formative years. You could reinvent yourself between middle school and high school, between high school and college, between college and early adulthood. There was room for shedding skin. So if you were shy at 14, you were not permanently labeled online. If you dressed poorly at 16, the evidence did not follow you into job interviews a decade later. Growth happened in relative privacy, and privacy allows experimentation. Experimentation is essential to identity formation. Adolescence and early adulthood are not meant to be polished stages. They are laboratories. You try on beliefs. You try on aesthetics. You try on social roles. When that laboratory exists without constant surveillance, risk-taking feels safer. This generation had the freedom to make mistakes without a global audience. And that freedom cultivated resilience. Mistakes did not define you permanently. They shaped you, but they did not brand you. There is also something else that privacy nurtures. Internal narrative control. Because when your life is not constantly documented, you become the primary storyteller. You decide how to frame your past. You choose which memories to elevate and which to release. That authorship strengthens self-concept. In contrast, constant digital documentation creates external mirrors that are difficult to escape. An unflattering post resurfaces. An old comment is rediscovered. Identity can become entangled with archived versions of oneself. The 1976 to 1986 group experienced youth before this dynamic dominated. They understand the power of digital footprints because they adopted digital life consciously. They were old enough to recognize the permanence. They watched early cautionary tales unfold as online culture matured. As a result, many from this generation hold a nuanced relationship with privacy. They value it deeply, not out of paranoia, but out of memory. They remember what it felt like to grow up without being searchable. That memory creates boundaries. It often results in more careful sharing, more selective posting, more conscious separation between private life and public persona. It also shapes how they view younger generations. There is sometimes quiet concern, not judgment, but concern, about what it means to have childhood permanently archived, about what it means to have adolescence documented in high resolution. Because they know the gift of forgetting. Forgetting is not weakness, it is psychological flexibility. When experiences fade naturally, they lose emotional intensity. They integrate into a broader narrative. They stop dominating the present. But when experiences remain accessible at any moment, saying they can re-trigger emotions repeatedly. The transitional generation learned emotional processing in an environment where time softened impact. That pacing matters. It created space between event and re-exposure. It allowed identity to evolve without constant reminders of previous versions. This also influences how they approach reputation. They understand that what is posted can endure. They witnessed early digital missteps become cautionary tales. They observed careers damaged by permanent online evidence. So they often move with measured awareness. They do not assume invisibility online. They assume traceability. But because they were not raised under constant traceability, they also carry an internal sense of privacy that predates platforms. There is a core self that existed before public profiles, and that core often feels more stable. Another subtle effect of analog memory is nostalgia itself. When fewer images exist, memory fills gaps creatively. The past can glow warmer. Moments feel larger than they were. That glow contributes to emotional grounding. It builds continuity between who you were and who you are. Digital saturation sometimes fragments that continuity by overexposing detail. The transitional generation carries fewer digital artifacts, but more narrative cohesion. They remember not just images, But feelings, the smell of summer pavement, the sound of a cassette rewinding, the tension of waiting for someone to call, the quiet thrill of discovering something without broadcasting it. These are private imprints, and private imprints create internal richness. In a world that increasingly rewards visibility, this generation grew up learning that value did not require documentation. Joy did not require sharing. Growth did not require public proof. Perhaps that is why many from this group still maintain selective boundaries around their lives. They know that not everything needs to be recorded to be real. They know that some experiences deepen when they remain unshared. Privacy, for them, is not secrecy, it is sanctuary. And sanctuary protects identity from becoming entirely external. The 1976 to 1986 generation did not grow up under the permanent gaze of digital systems. They grew up with memory as a living, breathing process. And that difference, invisible but profound, shaped how they understand themselves, their past, and the evolving tension between exposure and autonomy. Not everything must be archived. Some things are meant to be remembered, and then gently reshaped by time. Chapter 6. The 2008 Financial Crisis. The Psychology of Scarcity and Stability. For many born between 1976 and 1986, adulthood did not begin with expansion. It began with collapse. In 2008, the global financial system trembled. Housing markets crashed, banks failed, retirement accounts evaporated. Headlines were filled with words like foreclosure, bankruptcy, and recession. For those just entering the workforce or barely finding their footing in early careers, this was not an abstract economic event. It was a psychological imprint. You may have just graduated, or just purchased your first home, or just begun to believe that the traditional formula, work hard, build steadily, climb slowly, would hold. And then suddenly, it didn't. Jobs disappeared. Promotions froze. Entire industries contracted. Friends moved back home. Student loans felt heavier. Stability felt conditional. When instability hits during the foundational years of adulthood, it does more than disrupt finances. It reshapes trust. The 1976 to 1986 generation entered adulthood with analog patience and digital adaptability. But 2008 added another layer: economic vigilance. They learned that institutions could fail, that housing markets could collapse, that corporate loyalty did not guarantee security, that a degree did not automatically translate into opportunity. This realization does not disappear when markets recover. It settles into the nervous system. Many from this generation, even today, carry a quiet undercurrent of financial alertness. Even when income stabilizes, even when careers solidify, even when investments grow, there is often a voice that whispers, "It can shift again." This is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition. Early adulthood is when beliefs about money solidify. If that period is marked by recession, those beliefs often include caution, contingency planning, and an emphasis on emergency buffers. Savings matter more. Debt feels heavier. Risk is calculated carefully. Some became more conservative investors. Others diversified aggressively. Many developed side skills, backup plans, or entrepreneurial instincts, not always out of ambition, but out of memory, because they remember the ground moving. The psychological effect of 2008 also intersected with identity. This generation had grown up believing in certain narratives. Progress is upward. Stability increases with effort. Adulthood brings security. The crisis fractured that narrative. And when narratives fracture, individuals must rewrite them. And for some, this produced resilience. They adapted careers, retrained, pivoted industries, or relocated. Reinvention became part of adulthood. For others, It produced hesitation. Career decisions were approached with caution. Risk tolerance narrowed. Financial anxiety lingered longer than circumstances justified. Both responses stem from the same root: disruption during formation. There is also an emotional layer, rarely discussed. When financial collapse happens at the moment you are trying to prove yourself, it can create internalized pressure, a sense that you must compensate, that you must build faster, save more, secure harder. The transitional generation often sits between aging parents and younger children. They witnessed parents who may have believed in lifetime employment and stable pensions. And they also see younger generations navigating gig economies and digital entrepreneurship. They stand in the middle, aware that neither model guarantees safety. This positioning intensifies responsibility. They feel the need to provide, to stabilize, to buffer against volatility. And this sense of responsibility often drives work ethic, but it can also drive stress. The 2008 crisis did something subtle to time perception. It shortened confidence horizons. Long-term plans became conditional. 10-year strategies felt less certain. Flexibility replaced rigidity. This has advantages. It produces adaptability. It encourages diversification of income and skill sets. It discourages blind institutional trust. But it also produces fatigue. Living in a mindset of prepare for the next shock can be exhausting. And yet, despite the strain, there is strength here. The generation that entered adulthood through recession learned early that identity cannot rest entirely on external structures. Companies can downsize, markets can drop, industries can disappear. What remains? Skills, relationships, adaptability. The crisis forced a shift from external guarantees to internal capacity. It trained many to ask, if everything shifts again, what do I carry with me? That question builds resilience. It also builds humility. Because when you watch peers struggle through layoffs and lost homes, success feels less absolute. Empathy increases. Judgment softens. Financial scars are rarely visible, but they shape behavior quietly. They influence spending habits, career decisions, investment strategies, even parenting styles. Many from this group teach their children about savings earlier, about contingency, about not assuming permanence. They are not pessimistic, they are seasoned. The 2008 crisis did not define this generation entirely, but it marked it. It inserted a reminder into their adulthood. Stability is earned, but never guaranteed. And perhaps this is why many from the 1976 to 1986 group approached success with measured appreciation rather than entitlement. They know what fragility looks like. They have felt it. They entered adulthood during contraction and still built. Not recklessly, not blindly, but deliberately, with buffers, with backup plans. With a quiet understanding that progress is real, but volatility is part of the equation. The financial scar is not just a wound, it is a teacher. It taught them to prepare. It taught them to pivot. It taught them that identity must be larger than circumstance, and in a world that continues to shift, economically, technologically, culturally, that lesson remains deeply relevant. They learned early that security is not found in systems alone, it is built within. Chapter 7. The Helicopter Off. Childhood. Independence before supervision. There was a particular kind of freedom that shaped the 1976 to 1986 generation. It was not glamorous, it was not curated, it was not carefully supervised, it was simply normal. Parents were not tracking locations through apps. There were no constant text updates. There were no neighborhood group chats coordinating every movement. When children left the house, they often disappeared for hours, and that disappearance was expected. This was not neglect, it was cultural rhythm. You walked to a friend's house without announcing every step. You rode your bike across neighborhoods without GPS. You solved disputes without recording them. You figured out what to do with an afternoon without structured programming filling every minute. There was space. And inside that space, an independence grew. The children of this era were not micromanaged. They were not constantly evaluated. They were not shielded from every discomfort. They were allowed, sometimes forced, to navigate boredom, conflict, and minor failure alone. And autonomy, when experienced early, leaves a deep imprint. When no adult is immediately intervening, problem-solving becomes instinctive. You learn to assess risk. You learn to negotiate. You learn to recover from embarrassment without a protective filter. You also learn consequences in real time. If you forgot something, there was no instant fix. If you argued with a friend, you had to face them the next day. If you made a poor decision, you felt its effects directly. This created a psychological pattern, accountability without constant surveillance. It is subtle, but powerful. Children who are constantly monitored often internalize authority externally. Children who are given space must internalize regulation. The 1976 to 1986 generation developed internal regulators early. They knew when to come home. They learned how to manage time without digital reminders. They developed a sense of self not constantly mirrored by adult correction. This early autonomy shaped adult confidence. Even when circumstances changed, when technology accelerated, when economic instability hit, there was an underlying belief: I can figure this out. Not because everything had been easy, but because navigating uncertainty had been normal since childhood. There is also something important about unsupervised play. Unstructured play builds creativity. It builds negotiation skills. It builds imagination. And without organized schedules filling every afternoon, children invented games. They made rules. They adapted rules when conflicts arose. They learned flexibility socially. They also experienced boredom without rescue. No one rushed in with a device to entertain them. No one curated stimulation at the first sign of restlessness. So they built internal entertainment systems, imagination, storytelling, experimentation. This fosters self-sufficiency, and self-sufficiency carries into adulthood. It influences career decisions, relationship dynamics, emotional coping strategies. When faced with difficulty, many from this generation default to self-reliance first. They research, they experiment, they troubleshoot, they do not immediately outsource problem-solving. This does not mean they refuse help, but help is not the first reflex. And another byproduct of growing up in a less supervised environment is resilience to discomfort. Minor injuries were common. Social conflicts were direct. You were not insulated from embarrassment or rejection. You learned that discomfort passes. You learned that humiliation is survivable. You learned that not every emotional dip requires intervention. This creates emotional durability. In adulthood, when faced with criticism or professional setbacks, there's often a steadiness. Not indifference, but tolerance. Tolerance is strength. It prevents overreaction. It reduces fragility. There is also an interesting generational contrast here. As parenting models evolved, supervision increased, schedules intensified, digital monitoring expanded. The 1976 to 1986 generation experienced a transitional childhood, not as independent as earlier decades, but far less monitored than today. They remember autonomy, and because they remember it, they often value it deeply. They may encourage independence in their own children. They may resist over-surveillance. They may crave personal space in adulthood because they once had it naturally. Autonomy was not a philosophical concept. It was lived. It was walking home alone. It was making mistakes without documentation. It was learning to entertain yourself when no one else was responsible for doing it. And when the digital age later introduced constant connectivity, This internal independence acted as ballast. They could engage socially online, but they did not require constant digital affirmation to feel real. They could navigate remote work, but they did not collapse without physical oversight. They had already internalized self-direction. Perhaps the most important psychological result of a helicopter-off childhood is confidence in solitude. Solitude does not feel threatening. It feels familiar. And in a world increasingly saturated with noise and visibility, comfort with solitude is rare. The 1976 to 1986 generation grew up in a quieter environment, not just technologically, but socially. That quiet taught them to listen to themselves. It taught them to self-soothe. It taught them that not every problem needs immediate external validation. Independence is not loud, it is steady. It is the quiet belief that if something breaks, you can attempt to repair it. That belief formed long before smartphones entered their hands. And even as the world changed around them, that internal foundation remained. They were not raised under constant hovering. They were raised with room, and room creates strength. Chapter 8. The Art of Living with Contradictions. There is a particular strength that does not look like strength at first glance. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not dominate headlines. It does not trend. It lives quietly in the ability to hold two opposing truths at the same time without collapsing into either. For those born between 1976 and 1986, contradiction is not uncomfortable. It is familiar. They grew up analog but work digital. They value privacy but understand visibility. They crave stability but expect disruption. They are skeptical yet still hopeful. This is not confusion. It is integration. Living through rapid transformation trains the mind to stop demanding absolutes. When you have witnessed the world shift beneath your feet more than once, you learn that certainty is often temporary, and so you adapt. But you do not dissolve. The 1976 to 1986 generation stands in a cultural midpoint. They are not as disillusioned as late Gen X, shaped by Cold War anxieties and institutional mistrust. Nor are they as digitally embedded as younger millennials and Gen Z, who have never known a world without algorithmic influence. They see both, and seeing both creates tension, but also clarity. This generation understands the value of hard work in traditional systems. They entered careers when corporate ladders still seemed meaningful. They also witnessed those ladders destabilize. They saw layoffs. They saw industries automate. They saw loyalty fail to guarantee safety. So they neither romanticize institutions nor fully reject them. They engage cautiously. That caution is sometimes misinterpreted as cynicism. But it is not cynicism, and it is pattern awareness. They remember life before constant outrage cycles, before social media debates defined public discourse. They also live fully inside a time where narratives shift hourly and attention is currency. They can participate in digital conversations and then step away. They can feel frustration and still believe in incremental improvement. This balance is rare. The art of living with contradictions requires emotional maturity. It requires the ability to resist simplistic thinking, black or white, right or wrong, old or new. The transitional generation learned early that the world does not operate that cleanly. They remember the limitations of analog systems: inefficiency, slow communication, restricted access to information. They also see the psychological cost of hyperconnectivity, distraction, comparison, unto fragmentation. So they hold both truths. Technology liberates. Technology overwhelms. Privacy protects. Visibility empowers. Structure stabilizes. Flexibility survives. This internal dialectic creates resilience. When cultural debates polarize, they are less likely to swing completely to one extreme. They have lived through enough change to understand that most solutions carry trade-offs. They are not easily swept into utopian optimism. They are not easily trapped in apocalyptic pessimism either. They operate in gradients. There is also something deeply human about growing up in transition. When you have memories from before a system and after it, you become aware of loss and gain simultaneously. You can grieve what disappeared without rejecting what emerged. You can miss handwritten letters while appreciating instant communication, and you can miss slower weekends while recognizing the opportunity of remote connection. That emotional duality strengthens perspective. Perspective reduces panic. When new technologies appear, artificial intelligence, automation, immersive virtual spaces, many from this group feel curiosity rather than existential threat. Why? Because they have seen transformation before. They remember when the internet itself was frightening, when email felt invasive, when social media seemed unnecessary. They have already adjusted their worldview multiple times. Adjustment becomes muscle memory. At the same time, they do not surrender completely to every innovation. They evaluate. They compare. They ask, what do we gain? What do we lose? That question itself is wisdom. Living with contradictions also affects identity, and this generation does not cling rigidly to one version of self. They have reinvented before. They have adapted to shifting job markets, evolving social norms, changing communication styles. Identity for them is dynamic, but anchored by analog childhood. Dynamic because of digital adulthood. They can evolve without feeling erased, and that capacity is increasingly valuable. In a culture that often demands instant allegiance to trends or ideologies, the ability to pause, observe, and integrate becomes powerful. This generation often values nuance over noise. They understand that progress is uneven. They understand that stability is temporary. They understand that growth often requires discomfort. But they also understand that not every discomfort signals collapse. Having survived multiple paradigm shifts, technological, economic, cultural, they carry a quiet steadiness. They are not the loudest generation. They are not the most algorithmically amplified, but they may be among the most psychologically calibrated. Because calibration happens in transition. When you are forced to reconcile opposites, your thinking becomes layered. You can disagree without dehumanizing. You can adapt without abandoning. You can commit without blind faith. And perhaps that is the hidden art this generation mastered. Not choosing one world over the other, but building a bridge between them. Bridges are not glamorous structures. They are functional. They allow movement. They support weight. They connect separation. And the 1976 to 1986 group often occupies that position socially and professionally. They translate between older colleagues and younger teams. They explain emerging technologies to those resistant to them while also articulating human concerns to those accelerating change. They are comfortable in conversation across difference because their entire life has been one long conversation between eras. The art of living with contradictions is not about indecision. It is about synthesis. It is about understanding that complexity is not weakness. It is maturity. And in a world increasingly tempted by extremes, total immersion or total rejection, blind optimism or relentless skepticism, maturity may be the rarest trait of all. The transitional generation did not choose to be born in the middle. But being born in the middle trained them to see both sides, and seeing both sides is not confusion. It is depth. It is the ability to stand in tension without breaking, to adapt without dissolving, to remember without retreating, to move forward without erasing what came before. In a time that often rewards certainty, they embody something quieter, integration, and integration is strength. There is another layer to this ability to live with contradictions, and it reveals itself most clearly in how this generation relates to change itself. For some, change feels like an interruption. For others, it feels like identity. For those born between 1976 and 1986, change became background noise early in life. It was not an occasional disruption. It was a recurring pattern. New devices, new platforms, new economic realities, new cultural norms. When transformation repeats often enough, it loses its shock value. It becomes expected. And when change is expected, fear reduces. This does not mean there is no anxiety. It means anxiety is contextualized. It is understood as part of the cycle, not the end of stability. This mindset creates strategic patience. Rather than reacting impulsively to every shift, many in this group instinctively ask, is this structural or is this temporary? Is this evolution or just noise? That pause is powerful. It prevents overcorrection. It allows measured response instead of emotional swing. There is also humility embedded in living between eras. When you have witnessed the fall of once dominant systems, you are less likely to declare any present system permanent. When you have seen certainty dissolve, you hold your convictions with flexibility, and you believe, but you are willing to revise. You commit, but you remain observant. That balance is rare. It allows strength without rigidity. And perhaps this is the quiet legacy of the so-called pivotal generation. They learned that the world is neither fixed nor chaotic beyond understanding. It is transitional, always, and because they grew up inside transition, they carry within them a map for navigating it. Not perfectly, not loudly, but steadily. And in an era defined by acceleration, steadiness may be the most underrated form of power. For a long time, I thought being born between 1976 and 1986 meant existing in a footnote, not quite Gen X, not quite millennial, not clearly defined. It felt like standing in the hallway between two rooms, hearing conversations from both sides, but not fully belonging to either. There is a subtle loneliness in that. You grow up hearing narratives about the cynical generation or the digital native generation, and you recognize parts of yourself in both, but not completely. You remember the quiet of analog childhood, but you also built your adult life online. You understand the language of disruption, but you also value stability deeply. For years, that in-between space felt ambiguous. Now, I see it differently. The hallway is not a place of exclusion. It is a place of perspective. This generation was not overlooked, and it was positioned at the hinge of history, positioned at the pivot point where information accelerated, where economic assumptions cracked, where identity became both more public and more fragile. And living at a hinge shapes you. You learn early that permanence is an illusion. You learn that systems change. You learn that certainty can evaporate. But you also learn something more important. You can survive transition without losing yourself. That may be the defining trait of the pivotal generation. Not rebellion, not blind optimism, but calibrated adaptation. They did not grow up with digital permanence, and so they understand privacy. They did not grow up with algorithmic distraction, and so they remember stillness. They did not begin adulthood in prosperity, and so they understand fragility. But they also adapted. They learned the tools, they navigated the systems, they built careers inside structures that were still forming. They translated between older hierarchies and emerging platforms. They became fluent in transition, and perhaps that fluency is the quiet advantage of this era. When I look at the world now, artificial intelligence rewriting workflows, remote work dissolving geography, social norms shifting faster than ever, I notice something interesting. Many from this transitional generation do not panic. They assess. They ask questions. They compare it to what came before. They do not assume collapse. They do not assume utopia. They assume evolution. Because evolution is what shaped them, there is humility in that stance. And strength. Not the loud strength of certainty, but the steady strength of integration. Say, I used to think not fitting into a generational box meant lacking definition. Now I believe it means carrying more dimensions. This generation can hold contradiction without fracturing. It can value both solitude and connection. It can respect tradition while questioning it. It can embrace innovation without surrendering discernment. That balance is not accidental. It was forged in analog childhood, refined in digital adulthood, tested in economic instability, and strengthened through cultural acceleration. It is the product of living in transition long enough to realize that transition is the only constant. And perhaps that is the final lesson here. The world will continue to pivot, technology will continue to evolve. Markets will rise and fall. Cultural norms will shift again. But those who have already lived through multiple pivots carry a kind of internal compass. They know how to recalibrate. They know how to let go of outdated systems without erasing their core values. They know how to build new frameworks without discarding what still works. That is not confusion. That is maturity. The 1976 to 1986 generation may never have had a clean label, but labels were never the point. The point was perspective, and perspective is power. So if you were born in that narrow window, if you remember rotary phones and early Facebook logins, handwritten letters and email threads, economic optimism and recession headlines, understand something: you are not behind, you are not misaligned, you are not lost between eras. You are experienced in transition, and in a century defined by transition. And that experience is not a weakness, it is preparation. Perhaps the pivotal generation was never meant to dominate headlines or define trends. Perhaps it was meant to do something quieter, to connect, to translate, to steady. To remind the world that progress does not require forgetting, and adaptation does not require erasing identity. Maybe being born at the hinge of history was never an accident. Maybe it was alignment. And maybe the true value of this generation is not that it stood between two worlds, but that it learned how to walk across the bridge without falling into either side.